Hi, folks. This is Nathaniel Stinnett, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And this is our mini briefing on how the Environmental Voter Project measures our impact on voter turnout. And these mini briefings usually last about 9-10 minutes. They're short, to the point. And this is a really important topic to us because we obviously want to be able to not just make a difference, but prove that we are making a difference. It's important to our volunteers to know that their efforts actually work. It's important to our donors to know that they are funding something that works. And it's really important to us to know that what we are doing works. We also want to make a difference. That's why we all work for a nonprofit and work our butts off year round mobilizing voters. So today we are going to be discussing how EVP measures its impact on turnout. And what's important is to first lay the groundwork and discuss randomized controlled trials. I promise you it'll get more interesting than this in the next slides, but it's really important to start with this baseline. Perhaps you've heard of randomized control trials in the context of like testing medications or things like that, but it's also the gold standard of how social scientists measure the change in people's behavior. And in the voting context, it looks something like this. I'm going to give you an example. Let's say we at the Environmental Voter Project have identified 1 million super environmentalists in Florida who are unlikely to vote in an upcoming election. What we do not do is immediately start messaging to all 1 million of them to try to get them to vote. Instead, before that even happens, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into two groups. One of them is called a treatment group or intervention group sometimes, and the other is called a control group. Usually it's about an 80-20% split. I know in this graphic it looks 50-50, but usually it's about 80-20. The control group of low propensity environmental voters, we set that aside and we never talk to them. The remaining 80%, the treatment group, those are the people who we canvass and call and send postcards to and direct mail and digital ads. These are the people who get all of our behavioral science informed messaging that we know from previous experiments does increase turnout. Then the election happens. We still don't know how we did. Instead, we have to wait a few months for voter files to be updated. But then something crucially important happens. And I hope all of you take this with you from this mini briefing. Who you vote for is secret. But whether you vote or not, that's public record. It's public record what elections you vote in what elections you don't vote in. So what's really special about this point a few months after an election, when voter files are updated, is then we can see how many of the people in our control group voted and compare it to how many people voted in our treatment group. And as a reminder, both of these people came from the same initial group of low propensity environmental voters in Florida. They were all the same group of people. But what's magical about these randomized control trials is as long as that initial separation process into a treatment and control group is truly random, and as long as the numbers are big enough that we can get what's called statistical certainty, and I'm going to get into that in a few slides, what this process allows us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because let's say there was a huge storm in Miami on election day and that depressed turnout. Well, we've controlled for that because there are proportionately the same number of Miamians in our control group as in our treatment group. We have controlled for that. Let's say there were dozens of other groups who were mobilizing voters. Hell, let's say they were mobilizing environmental voters or even low propensity environmental voters. Yeah, we've controlled for that too. Unless they hacked into our system and decided to only target the low propensity environmental voters that were in the Environmental Voter Project's treatment group and not the ones in our control group, well, we've controlled for that. This is the beauty of randomized controlled trials, is that you are able to control for outside variables and isolate what your sole impact is on turnout, and then measure it with real scientific rigor and precision. And just as an example, over the past, say, 3 years, going back to 2020, what we've been able to measure at the Environmental Voter Project is that we were solely responsible for increasing turnout while controlling for all outside variables in a huge number of local, state, and federal elections. Now, as you can see, we tend to do better in lower turnout local elections than we do in like really high turnout presidential general elections. Surprise, surprise, it's harder to increase turnout when more money is spent and more people are voting. When the baseline of turnout is higher, it's a little bit harder to then increase on top of that. But we're very, very proud of this track record. And for those of you who don't think that, say, like 1.8 percentage points is a big deal in a state like Pennsylvania, well, ask Donald Trump or Joe Biden how big a deal it is. These are big, big numbers. Now, to be clear, when we say we increase turnout, 3.6 percentage points in Alaska over our control group, we are not claiming that we increase turnout of all voters 3.6 percentage points. No, we don't care about all voters. We care about environment first voters who are unlikely to show up for that election. But that's not as small a target population as you might think it is. Just thinking about the 2022 midterms in Pennsylvania, say, we were targeting, I think, over 700,000 people. We were targeting over 1 million in Texas. Turns out there are a whole lot of these unlikely to vote environment first voters. And as you can see, we can prove that we are dramatically increasing turnout rates from them. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the numbers that you see here are only the instances where we can prove that we are solely responsible for increasing turnout and that it's not due to random occurrence. What that does not mean is that we're not increasing turnout in all the other elections. We're active in hundreds of elections each year. We're probably increasing turnout among our targets in most, if not all of them. We just can't prove it. And it's important to us at the Environmental Voter Project to only report out election-specific results where we have a greater than 95% certainty that it wasn't due to random occurrence. And this is called statistical significance. Those are the only ones we report out. And just to give you an idea of how this stuff is measured, we're not going to get into statistics here, don't worry. But let's take a small election example, okay? Let's say we've identified 1,000 voters, or let's say we've identified 1,240 low propensity environmental voters in a little city council race somewhere, let's say in Iowa. We're targeting 1,000. We've put 240 in our control group. We mobilize those 1,000 in our treatment group. Then the election happens. A few months later, voter files are updated. Oh, wow, look at this. Turnout in our treatment group was 50%. Turnout in our control group was 48%. We increased turnout by 2 percentage points, right? No, not right. Maybe we did, but because these populations of targets and also in our control group are so small, we can't say with statistical certainty that that 2 percentage point bump in the treatment group is not due to just random occurrence. You don't need to be a statistician to understand that the larger the numbers involved are, the more confidence you can have that the results are actually due to your intervention and not due to random occurrence. And as an example of this, let's increase the size by 100 times. Let's take a large election example. Let's say we're mobilizing voters in Texas, and we've identified 124,000 who are unlikely to vote. 100,000 in our treatment group, 24,000 in our control group. The election happens, then voter files are updated. Oh, wow, turnout was 50% in our treatment group and 48% in our control. Now, because the numbers are so big, we can claim that that 2 percentage point bump in turnout is what's called statistically significant. It is due solely to our impact, solely to our interventions, and not due to random occurrence. And there are a whole bunch of calculations that go into measuring whether a result is statistically significant or not, and we don't need to get into these in a mini briefing. But I just wanted to use these examples to highlight how larger elections make it easier to claim statistical significance and show that your impact, to show that you actually had an impact. In fact, with a group this large, we could even, as you can see down here in the last example, increase turnout only 0.5 percentage points and still claim statistical significance, because the treatment group and the control groups are so large that the statistical calculations show us, yes, we can claim that this was not due to random occurrence. And 95 times out of 100, these results will be replicated, and turnout in our treatment group will be higher in our control group. All right. When you look at environmental voter project results and we say, hey, in a specific election, we increased turnout X percentage points, this is what we mean. We mean there was a statistically significant result of this much, and we can claim that we were solely responsible for it while controlling for all outside variables, and it wasn't due to random occurrence. That's the first way that we measure our impact on turnout at the Environmental Voter Project. It is election specific. The second way that we do it is our cumulative impact over the long term. And going back to, I think this data is based on February of 2023. So as of February of 2023, we can tell by looking in voter files that we had communicated with over 9.5 million unique low propensity environmental voters. Because whenever we target and actually communicate with a voter, going all the way back to the end of 2015, we tag them in our voter files and we track them. And remember, whether you vote or not is public information. And so we can track these people's voting histories and see which of them are staying bad voters or infrequent voters, and which of them are becoming more consistent or even perfect super voters. And what we know is that as of February of 2023, almost 1.5 million of those 9.5 million had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. Now remember, we were only targeting these people because by definition, they were awful at voting. We would have been talking to them if they hadn't have been unlikely to vote in at least an election. And now these people had become such consistent super voters that they're not skipping library trustee or even dog catcher elections. Now, to be clear, this is a different way of measuring turnout than the previous one I discussed, randomized control trials. What's different about this long-term cumulative metric is this does not have the same statistical rigor of a randomized control trial. We cannot claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. In fact, we most definitely aren't. But we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other organization that's been active in now almost 1,900 different elections, local, state, and federal in these states, going all the way back since we started. And this is what our year-round work talking to these voters does. It not only changes voting from a thing you do every now and then to a habit, but it communicates through the voter file to all these other organizations that these people who weren't voting have now started voting. And that's like a bugle call to all these other campaigns to come in and start mobilizing these new voters. And now all of a sudden, everybody is mobilizing these voters at no cost to us. And we can move on and start talking to the next group of low propensity environmental voters. And just to give you an idea of what these numbers might mean, when we say 33,000 of the non-voting or infrequently voting environmentalists in Nevada who we've targeted are now super voters who never miss an election, well, 33,000 in a state like Nevada is a pretty big deal. In 2022, the U.S. Senate race was decided by only 9,007 votes. The presidential in 2020 was decided by just a few hundred votes more than that number. And look, in Arizona, where we've helped create almost 110,000 super voter environmentalists, I mean, that's almost 10 times as large as the presidential margin was in 2020. It's, I think, maybe 5 or 6 times as large as the gubernatorial margin in 2022. These cumulative impacts are what our ultimate goals are at the Environmental Voter Project. We want to so dramatically increase the number of environment first voters, not non-voters, but actual voters, that we not only change the type of people who get elected, but we change the policies that they are willing to make. Because if there is one thing that motivates all politicians, it's the prospect of winning or losing an election. And when they see hundreds of thousands of new environment first consistent voters, yeah, they are going to change the priorities that they lead on and legislate on. Because politicians are in the election winning business. They have to go where the voters are. And I know that sounds cynical, but it's just the way democracy works, right? It's the brutal arithmetic that underlies every election. Either you get 50% plus one of the votes, or you don't get to be a politician anymore. So what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is in specific elections, but also over the long term, to try to create such an enormous number of environment first voters that we scare the bejesus out of politicians. That we scare them so much that they say, oh man, I need to start taking these issues seriously, or I might not get another chance to be a politician. So this is how we measure our impact at the Environmental Voter Project. If you would like more information on our results, you can go to environmentalvoter.org to our results tab. And if you would like to get notified when we have more mini briefings or other longer briefing webinars, please subscribe to our YouTube page or leave us a comment, like this video so that other people will see it. And I really look forward to seeing you at our next mini briefing.